Good morning. I'm Brian Anderson. I'm the instructor for American Literature 2. Welcome to summer 2020. We're living in very interesting times right now. As you can see, I kind of need a haircut, and I think a lot of us are in lockdown of some kind or another right now, unless we're working in more uh, essential positions, I guess is the way they're putting it. Uh, so some of our first responders and people like that might be out there working. Walt Whitman, one of the poets we're reading at the beginning of this semester, worked as a nurse during the Civil War. And the term nurse meant something a little bit different back then. There wasn't as much technology or medicine available, but it is an interesting reason to look at Whitman and to consider him from a modern light. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Whitman and Dickinson, the two poets that we're reading this week, and try to give you a little bit oriented toward their work and their perspectives. Uh, Both of these poets are considered transitional poets, represent they're writing during a period between American Romanticism, uh, Transcendentalism, figures like Emerson and Thoreau, and Washington Irving earlier than that, and realism, which we'll see with Mark Twain and authors like Jack London, who are writing more in the tradition of representing things as they really are. Uh, Whitman and Dickinson both have elements of realism, but they also have elements of exuberance and romanticism in their work. And of course, they're both poets, so they're different in that sense. They also represent the beginning of American poetic sensibilities in a lot of ways. Whitman, in particular, he was very popular during his lifetime, very well known, and is credited with inventing free verse or becoming the first champion of that. And that may be an overstatement, but certainly he uh, is credited as being the father of free verse, which is uh, poetry that doesn't pay close attention to regular rhyme or meter. So it's a little bit more loose limbed, more unstructured, more American in that sense, more independent. And that's kind of one reason we think of Whitman as very American, but also his diction, the word choices that he makes are very American, and the things that he focuses on are very American. Emily Dickinson is a little bit different. Uh, she's not as focused on the common man. She's a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more oriented towards spiritual matters, but she's also modernist in her poetry in certain ways, and so is Whitman. But Dickinson has these really unusual poetic choices that she makes in terms of punctuation and capitalization that we associate with more modern poetic works. So that's one reason we read both of these poems. They represent sort of the beginning of American literature in that way. Dickinson is known as being reclusive, and she didn't publish very much in her lifetime. Uh, the fact that she was reclusive may be kind of an overstatement as well. I think she was reclusive in terms of being any kind of public figure, and she did, spend a lot of time at home, but she did have a social life and a family life of her own as well. She only published 10 poems during her lifetime. As I said, she's known for this unconventional style. You'll notice the way she uses punctuation, capitalization a little bit differently. She writes about death a lot, about spirituality a lot, but we also tend to undervalue her sense of humor, her irony. So we're going to look at those things as well. Walt Whitman, pictured here, 1819 to 1992. So you can see the time periods here we're talking about, uh, closely aligned. Uh, Whitman had a longer life. He was also one of the most photographed people of the 19th century, famous people, I should say. Here's a photograph of him in his later years. We also have audio recordings of him, so that's pretty interesting. He died and lived his later years in Camden, New Jersey, where I was born. And there's a tradition of New Jersey poetry that we associate with him, as well as William Carlos Williams, and uh, also uh, even authors like or songwriters like Bruce Springsteen. So, the sort of the working man's tradition. I'll come back to that in a minute. Whitman was born in 1819 on Long Island, so he lived his whole life up in that area. He worked for newspapers and as a reporter, and also delivering papers, and as a uh, uh, printer and things like that. So his early experiences working in journalism as it existed at the time, the newspaper business, very much more a sort of a working man's sort of environment at the time. And he got really a street level view of Manhattan as it existed at the time in Brooklyn, kind of being around people who were doing sort of normal jobs, everyday jobs, building the city, making the city work. That gives him a lot of material for his poetry, but it also gives him a certain perspective. He had a great respect for that kind of work and for that kind of existence. So we'll see that in Song of Myself as well. Here's Whitman pictured with a rebel soldier, a friend of his, I guess, in 1865. Whitman served on the Union side. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about the Civil War at this time and how we should remember it. One thing that's really important to remember is and we'll come back to this, is the level of fatality surrounding the Civil War, with at least 600,000 people dying, and the medical care that was involved in that, because there were survivors as well, and there was medical care that was available. And as I said, Whitman served as a nurse. So one of his poems that we'll look at has to do with that as well, the wound dresser. Um, The Leaves of Grass was Whitman's self-published book, and it really changed American literature. Even though he publishes it himself, which nowadays people do that through Amazon and all sorts of ways online, and it has a certain stigma about it. But there are great poets that started this way, and with poetry in particular, sometimes there's no other way to get it going, to get people's interest. Uh, Eventually, by it becomes to be praised by Emerson, and it comes to be recognized as a work that changes American literature by introducing us to this really specific American voice, that free verse, as well as American diction, ways of Americans speaking. The ways that Americans speak are different from British, for instance. So, how are we taking control of our own language in America? Whitman represents that, as well as his focus on a certain kind of culture. This is a picture of Whitman's personal copy of Leaves of Grass. Uh, it's interesting we have artifacts and pictures of some of this stuff in the record. And here's a page from his hospital notebook. So I'm not sure exactly what it says. Pretty good handwriting, but if you're not used to reading cursive all the time, it may be a little difficult. But you can see there the phrase "bodies of dead men," and certainly a lot of the work that medical personnel during the Civil War were involved in had to do with very grim sort of realities surrounding the war. Here's Whitman's gravesite. And sort of interesting in that it represents the kind of graves we saw a lot during Victorian times, from people that were well established or famous or rich in some way. And the idea during Victorian times would, build the best sort of tomb you can, the best monument that you can, as a sign of your devotion, or as a kind of a shout out, or whatever you want to say. We don't see burials in the same way, perhaps today. It depends on your own background, I suppose, your own beliefs. But it was definitely more of a trend than for these elaborate burials. So Whitman's influence can't be overstated, I think, in terms of how he helped to create this American voice in poetry. As I said, he influenced later poets like the beat poets, which is, you've heard the term beatnik, maybe, Allen Ginsberg, uh, who in turn influenced the countercultural revolution of the 60s. So these guys are working in the 50s, 40s, and 50s, and they influenced the 60s. So you can trace this line back to uh, the time of Whitman and sort of breaking up societal norms and challenging those norms and doing stuff a little bit differently. And Whitman was proud to be that person. He even influenced singers like Bruce Springsteen, as I said before, Bob Dylan, these troubadour musicians in America who uh, write about real experiences, but the gritty sort of side of life, and they've been championed by uh, the working man, if you want to call him that. Sort of a overused phrase maybe, but uh, you know, definitely represents something important in the American culture. Voices that are perhaps not always heard from in earlier forms of literature that were more elitist. Song of Myself and Leaves of Grass in general. Song of Myself is a longer poem within that work. And some of the themes here you can see, I won't read all these, but these in particular are important: the connection of self to world, the brotherhood of man, respect for the ordinary man. So all these connections of kind of bringing people together, but also connecting the self to other people and America. This is the Leaves of Grass frontispiece. So a picture of Whitman there as a younger man. You can see pretty dashing figure with the hat and all that. This is the opening lines of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. It's very famous lines of poetry, and something we're going to talk about in our discussion, hopefully, this will come about or come up, is sort of like what he means by myself here, and you know, is he trying to include the reader? It's a different sort of lyrical voice than we've seen in poetry before in terms of bringing the reader in, connecting the poet to the reader. It's not just the poetic voice saying, look how interesting and wonderful I am. It's also about something more universal, about the themes that he does get into in his poetry, connecting man to each other, connecting the self to the universe, the poet to mankind, and so forth. Okay, so that's an introduction to Dickinson and Whitman, and kind of focus more on Whitman there. And so we'll see what comes about in the discussions on these two authors.